Order and welcome to today's session of the Transport Select Committee when we continue our strategic transport objectives inquiry. We have a split panel today in the sense that three of our witnesses are here in person in Westminster and one witness is joining us, I think, from Inverness via virtual link. But before we get going, could I invite each of you just to state your name and organisation, please, for the purposes of our records. Start with Ben on my left.
Hi, I'm Ben Hopkinson, policy researcher from Britain Remade.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Stephen Joseph. I'm a professor at the University of Hertfordshire.
Hi there, I'm Andy Meaney. I'm partner at Oxera Consulting LLP.
Thank you. And Dr. Laird?
Hi, I'm James Laird. I'm a director of my own company, Peak Economics, and I'm also a visiting fellow at Institute for Transport Studies at the University of Leeds.
Thank you. Welcome all, and we're very grateful to you for giving us your time and opinions this morning. Excuse me. If I could start off by perhaps asking Andrew and Stephen first. At the initial session we had, Lord Hendy, Chair of Network Rail, made the point, transport is not an end in itself mostly, it is a means to an end. Better transport connectivity produces growth, jobs, housing, social cohesion and sustainability. What do you understand the government's strategic transport objectives to be? Andrew, perhaps start with you.
Yeah, so if I can start, thank you, and thank you for inviting me here. I think it's pretty clear that there are some objectives that are written down for the Department for Transport that are agreed with the Treasury around levelling up through to operational things of being an effective department. But I think there's perhaps a disconnect, which perhaps we can come on to, between those objectives either for the department or actually more generally for the current government and future governments, which then flow through to what the Department for Transport is focusing on and is trying to enable the transport network to achieve, and which then it plays through into its value for money assessments, for example. So I think one can find objectives for the Department for Transport, but perhaps they're not entirely consistent with the government's wider objectives, and then those objectives aren't necessarily the ones that one might see focused on in a strategic case for a piece of infrastructure or a case for digital investment in our road network.
Again, we'll start to explore all of these themes as the morning goes on. But Stephen, your initial thoughts, please.
I think you've heard from people about from previous sessions about the difficulty of linking up transport and land use planning. And for me, that seems to be a particular disconnect, actually, which has a huge impact. So transport is a means to an end, but the way in which it plays out in relation to land use planning is really important in terms of the kinds of transport patterns that appear on the ground. And we see transport contributing to and being part of wider challenges that government faces on social exclusion. I think you've already had quoted this study for Transport for the North on transport-related social exclusion, and on tackling climate change, where transport is the biggest single contributor now to carbon emissions, as well as at much more local levels in relation to local economies. So I think there are some really big issues here. We did a study at the university for the Transport Planning Society. In fact, we did two studies in 2020 and 2022 on the state of the nations in transport planning, and found that Wales and Scotland had much clearer transport strategies than the Department of Transport did for England or the UK. We did, in fact, in 2022, we did a whole chapter on how the four nations of the UK were moving differently on transport, and particularly on this issue of strategic transport objectives.
Thank you. And then Ben and then Dr. Laird, if you have any initial thoughts to add to those?
Sure, yeah. I completely agree with Stephen about the role of land use being important but not properly considered. I think one of the other things that's important to highlight is that there are clearly broad goals that the DFT, that the government want to get through transport, whether that be levelling up or trying to reach net zero and decarbonisation. But I think it's hard to say that those goals actually shape a coherent strategy and a coherent pipeline of projects. So it's right now, how do you apply these goals to individual projects? But instead, if you'd like a proper strategy, it would be across a number of projects, how do we reach a goal? How do we electrify a number of lines at a time and get a rolling electrification program going to reach net zero, rather than how does an individual line meet a certain kind of predetermined objectives around net zero. So I think it's these applications of broad goals towards a pipeline of projects that really needs to be considered if we're talking about strategic transport objectives.
Thank you. And Dr. Laird.
Yeah, thank you. The question as in what do I think the department's strategic objectives are? I have to admit I don't know what they are. I've looked at their websites and their publications, and they identify priorities. If you look at the delivery agencies, the national highways and the rail networks, they have objectives and they have priority and investment strategies and programs. One of the things that I do in my role with the University of Leeds colleagues is we deliver training courses on transport investment appraisal for the Department for Transport, for their junior economists. And ideally, we would like to case study a Department for Transport major project, but we actually case study a West of England project, which has a city vision. It has strategic objectives, and flowing from that, you have a set of project objectives, which then feed through into the actual appraisal. And this is, partly we don't see the coherence between the priorities at the top end and the project objectives at the lower end. I think this is quite important with respect to transport. Transport is a very unique and very interesting area, because it touches into everything. And if you look at the department's strategic priorities, its priorities are growing the economy, making transport a better thing, better to use, and decarbonisation. Now, these are three very, very different priorities, and it would be unusual probably for a single project to address all three of those. Therefore, it's quite important that you see how the portfolio as a whole addresses it.
Thank you. Those priorities or objectives are not necessarily mutually exclusive. But how do you sense both the department specifically and government generally will balance those in setting out the overall policy programme?
They're not mutually exclusive, but I think it's rare that you get a project that is delivering heavily on all three. And there are a lot of projects which are about just making the transport better to use, the transport system better to use, a lot of the bus type projects, for example. You potentially could have a strong vision of a growing economy that is city-based, as in the vehicle for growth as the cities, driven through agglomeration. You could have within that, you could have a strong public transport system that reinforces the strength of the city with active travel. And the usability. So that in that sense, these projects would be, the portfolio would hit all three. You might struggle in that situation to see where investment in the the road network, the National Highways road network may fall. You might be wanting point-to-point city connectivity, city centre to city centre connectivity, rather than a point that Stephen and Ben have made there about land use change. If you're investing in the road network, you may get urban sprawl, which is going to work against your objectives. So I do think that, it is. I look at project appraisals, and you say that they're not mutually exclusive, but you look at Lower Thames Crossing. It's big on the National Highways projects are big on big on carbon. They produce a lot of carbon, but they grow the economy. So I don't see that there is no role for road projects, but they have to be in a portfolio where there is decarbonisation happening elsewhere.
And the other panelists, do you have any thoughts on that point and balancing the different objectives?
If I can come in on that. I think it's important to consider objectives like decarbonisation and net zero in the whole and not on a project-by-project basis, as James was mentioning. Britain Remade has done some modelling on this, and we found that the entirety of the road investment strategies projects from 2015 to 2020 only increased the emissions from motoring by 0.1%. Whereas if you sped up the EV rollout by only a year, you could reduce motoring emissions by 2%. So I think it's clear that an individual road project will lead to more emissions. But if you compare that to the 247,000 miles of road that we have now, it's not gonna. It's a drop in the ocean. But you have to consider it alongside the fleet change. As we roll out more EV chargers, roll out more EV cars, emissions will drop over time. And a lot of these projects in the RIS have real economic growth benefits. So if you're saying that every new road project cannot lead to any more emissions, you're going to have a kind of defensive net zero almost. You're not going to build anything. You're not going to get growth building infrastructure. But you will have a small lowering of emissions. But if you consider over the whole transport objectives, whether it comes to rail, public transport, walking, cycling, and cars, you can see that the emissions that might increase from road projects are way outweighed by the shifts in car use as well as the shifts to public transport.
I think I'll beg to differ with my colleague here on that.
That's good. We don't want unanimity of views.
If you look at individual road projects using National Highways' own numbers, some of them do add significantly to carbon emissions. And I think it's those that are the most controversial, actually. I think there's a better framework for this, which is to think of decarbonisation as the framework within which other transport decisions are taken, because we need to have pathways to decarbonise transport. And all the evidence from the likes of Gillian Annable, who you've heard, the committee's heard from before, and who's a colleague of James's, and other colleagues of James's in Leeds, say that you can't just rely on technological change to reduce carbon emissions from transport, such as electric vehicles. You have to look at reducing car mileage as well. And it's not lots of car mileage. We're talking 20%, which is, I think, the Scottish Government's target. But which is, if you in context, the difference between term time and holiday traffic levels is 15% on average. So we're not talking about enormous changes, but we are talking about setting pathways to decarbonisation. We would argue from the work we've done in rural areas, the university has focused a lot of work on what to do about and the challenges facing transport outside cities, that it is possible, even outside cities, to find ways of alternatives to car use that can help reduce road traffic and road use. So I think given the nature of the challenge of climate change, I think it is an overarching issue. But within that, you can have frameworks in which all sorts of projects can go ahead. And actually, I think there's a tendency to think about big projects actually as all sorts of reports from the Eddington Review in 2006 onwards have said, actually packages of small projects really make a difference. And actually we saw that with the coalition government's local sustainable transport fund, really made a difference in terms of behaviour change on the ground, by providing lots of small projects rather than the focus that I think all politicians and decision makers have a tendency to jump to, which is single big projects.
Thank you. And before I turn to my colleagues, Andrew, just some thoughts on
I was just going to say,
objectives.
I think what Stephen is saying is that if decarbonisation is your only objective, then you would set up transport decision making with respect to that objective. But of course, there are other objectives as we're hearing, and so I think what's perhaps missing is an understanding that there's an accepted set of objectives that the government has established for the country, to which transport would contribute. And then what you would do is to establish, whether it's analysis, whether it's frameworks to test each incremental project, whether that's a big project or a small project, against the transport system's ability to deliver against those objectives. And of course, those objectives do trade off. I mean, that's why we're here in Parliament, is that people have to trade off between different objectives. We have to apply weights to those different objectives. But I think what happens now is that perhaps we don't articulate well how a particular decision is going to trade off against differing policy objectives. And I think if we were encouraging decision makers to express how those trade-offs are being made in individual circumstances or across a portfolio, I think that would aid transparency. It would help the public to understand why a particular package of measures is being taken rather than a different one.
Thank you. Paul, if we could turn to you now.
Thanks, Chair. Just to frame the discussion just a little bit before I start, what we're trying to do at the moment is just talk about the objectives we're getting, and we'll talk about the evaluation process separately later, so just to prevent a bit of trying to stick to the knitting, if you like, in terms of making progress as we go through the questions. I'm sure we've touched on already, one of the department's outcomes, or priority outcomes, is supposed to be to grow and level up the economy. I think the question that I've got there, so I'm going to come to Andrew and Ben first on this one, is about what role the transport system plays in doing that, in improving the economy. And I look at quotes like, where we're told that, for example, jobs growth in towns, 7%, has been half of that in cities, outside of London, 14%, which is a quarter of that in London, 28%. So the growth in jobs has been dramatically different in the very tight urban centres. London first, then the cities, then the towns. And I'd just like to go into a little bit of thought about how transport can facilitate a movement of that into different places. Can I start with yourself, Andrew, please?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, because a lot of decision making and focus can enable cities as vehicles for economic growth, and I'm sure James can come on to that in a minute. But of course, it's not just cities that will benefit economically from strong transport links, and I think there's definitely perhaps a missing role, a missing understanding of even sort of quite basic levels of connectivity into and out of towns, into and out of cities, which, as we know, has declined considerably in the last sort of 10 or 15 years, and how you can use that connectivity to enable people to choose jobs maybe locally rather than regionally or nationally. I think perhaps with the pandemic we saw some changes in travel patterns where people, whether it's through working from home, whether it's through other changes to what they were doing, different balance of leisure and work time, that you will have seen more regional trips, which will have enabled some growth in towns and maybe even villages rather than in cities. But to the extent that that's sort of flipping back as people move more back into office-based work, then perhaps that's sort of unravelling to some extent. But to come on to your question, I think what transport's doing in towns is connecting people to jobs, it's connecting people to services, and it's also enabling housing development around those towns rather than maybe on the edge of cities. And transport, of course, it's a vehicle, it's one means of enabling that growth. Where transport can really help is where there are clusters that are forming. But of course, those clusters can form in towns as much as they form in cities, or they form in counties rather than in big urban areas. And so I think we have to focus our resources. There's been a preponderance of resources into cities and obviously the job growth that you're alluding to. But to the extent that we can see into the future and imagine what transport can enable in towns as well, then I think there is some prospect of shifting money between where it's being perhaps spent at the moment and where it can be spent in the future.
Just to explore that slightly further before I come to you, Ben, is the what should government specifically do to try and encourage what you've just said?
I think we can get hung up, as Stephen said, on some quite big schemes, but I think even imagining how connectivity can be improved on a village by village, town by town basis. We could spend the transport budget quite differently. At the moment, we are focusing on particular schemes on enabling interurban connections through the SRN, through the Network Rail, but we're perhaps not spending so much on bus services, providing those connections to towns and people to jobs, people to hospitals and that kind of thing. So there is, I think, an emphasis that you could develop on establishing connectivity as a almost a basic amount of connectivity that people can have, and then imagine the schemes that you would need in order to deliver that connectivity to towns and villages, in addition to what you're doing in cities. So there's, I think, imagining it from that perspective of actually what does that town or village need to have. Is it public transport? Is it car-based? And then what can you do? How do you grow the economy as a consequence of improving that connectivity?
Okay, because I think it comes to big picture. I'm going to come to Ben for the things, but I just want to make another little comment which just picks up a little bit on what Stephen said a few seconds ago about the impact of potential to change rural transport movement. We all gravitate to our own constituencies, and if I look at mine, it's a Sedgefield constituency. I've got 3 villages, Trimdon, Fishburn, Sedgefield itself, that I want to connect to Newton Aycliffe, where the jobs are. The transport patterns have changed because of COVID, because people aren't using the buses as much to go shopping. That's reduced the demand in the buses. The buses are therefore being closed off. Therefore, you're driving car ownership in terms of making sure that people can get to the jobs themselves. What are the sort of things that government should be doing to make sure that the people who are supplying the bus routes actually keep them going to facilitate that situation? Because the way that BSIPs and those sort of things are working at the moment seem to get hung up in not actually getting the money out to those sort of places. I'll let you start on that, Ben, if you don't mind, and pick up on what we were talking with the previous questions as well.
Sure, yeah. So I think if we're considering kind of levelling up priorities, we have to start with the consideration that Britain is quite unique amongst similar countries, your France, your Germany, your Spain, America, Japan, in that Britain's second cities, so cities that aren't the capital, are less productive than the national average. So everywhere else you get these benefits of living in a city or even near a second city, being able to commute in. But Britain alone is unique in the fact that our second cities are less productive. And you have to then think, well, there are only 9 British cities that have either tram or mass transit system, compared to 30 French cities and 60 German cities. Looking at Leeds, only 4 in 10 Leeds residents can get to the city centre within 30 minutes by public transport, compared to 9 in 10 Marseille residents. And this makes our cities effectively smaller. It means that fewer people can get to the high-quality jobs. Fewer people can specialize as much, and the agglomeration effects are a lot smaller. So if the government were considering how to rectify this and how to properly have transport feed into levelling up objectives, I think would be considering a larger pipeline of tram projects, of reaching Britain's second cities and making sure that their effective economic sizes are larger because more people can get to the city centre quickly. On Paul's specific point about rural villages, I think it's important to avoid the kind of death spiral that happens with low ridership leading to a cutback of services, leading to low ridership, so on and so on, until you don't have any bus services left. I think that's working with local communities to see what an effective public transport system would look like for them, and hearing feedback about how they might want bus services to serve this particular village to this other one, and that's not being provided by the market so far.
Anything you'd like to add, Stephen, and then I'll come.
Yes. Well, I think I know the analysis that Ben's talking about in relation to cities, and particularly I think the Centre for Cities and also various the Open Data Institute have done a lot of work on that. But I think going below that, you're right about the importance of places, of smaller places outside cities, and being able to get to jobs. And in the work we've done, we've found some places that are really making a difference here. We tend to cite Cornwall here as a place that's done really a lot on rural public transport, and really, although they've had a fair bit of levelling up money, they've used it effectively to do things that almost anybody could do, like making the buses meet the trains, and so you can buy a whole bus times thick. You can pick up free a whole bus times booklet for the whole of Cornwall that tells you how they fit together. If you turn up at St Austell railway station, there's a bus terminal outside with all the buses on it. So there are some places that have done this and are doing well at it. And I think some of this is about just spreading good practice. And though Cornwall have spent a lot of money on their buses, they are spending, I think, about 50% of their network is tendered, but they've done the tendering wisely. So they have a Transport for Cornwall brand that some of which operates outside the council depots. So they've done lots of really basic things that have really made a difference in this. And I think my answer, the one-word answer to how do we deal with this, is devolve. Because actually, there's no point people in London working out, whether local authority, whether a particular bus should run to Newton Aycliffe or whatever. That should be devolved, and with powers and funding to make that work. Just as an overseas model, since it's been mentioned, a couple of years back, the French passed droit de mobilité, which is a right to mobility, which is now spread out to rural areas and has led to the creation of sort of passenger transport executive kind of bodies, even in quite rural France, and is for the first time focusing people on what money's around on transport and how to make it work better as a right to mobility for people to be able to get to work and hospital and so on.
That's always nice to hear some examples of good practice. And just in terms of coming to yourself, James, I just want to develop one further point at the same time, because it's more your area, and that's the whole impact and the conflict that you get between the two outcomes of trying to grow and level up the economy and reducing environmental impacts. And if you look at the environmental impact of transport, it's got to be more in a dense urban area, and that's where you can make the biggest difference in a way. So how do we manage a strategy that's not affecting the rural areas in terms of the need for connectivity too much because of the policies that you're putting into cities, or do they need to be radically different? How do you balance that?
Yeah, I'll try and pick that up as well. I guess your initial question was, what role does transport play in growing and levelling the economy? It's an area that I research and we teach on, and I think it's useful to distinguish in this context and the different other panel members have contributed here is between transport projects that are within a city or a travel to work area and those that are between cities. So I think unambiguously we would expect that within the travel to work area that we're strengthening the city. I would caveat on Ben's point about just investing in pure mass transit, but not just because I think that you've got to be thinking about density, and this comes back to earlier points about land use patterns, because the one thing we know is that once the houses are built, they're there for, I wouldn't say they're there forever, but they're there for multiple generations. And we have path dependency. So we have to be very careful about when we invest in the city, because what we're actually wanting to do to grow the city, to grow the economy, is we're wanting that density in the city. And that comes through both the transport connectivity and the land uses. When we think about between cities, we're looking at, there's a tension here because the development can happen at either end of the line, as it were. So we have to be very careful here about how much of the activity is going to centralise, in the core of the country, and how much is going to go elsewhere. But one thing that we do know is that by strengthening cities, we can grow those parts of the economy. I mean, to give an idea as to what the scale is, which I think is what you asked, and this isn't, returning again to the point about I think people are merging priorities and objectives a little bit in some of the discussion, because an objective to me has to be smart. So it's got to be specific, measurable, achievable, and have a time bound on it. So, when we say levelling up the economy, I mean, to give you an idea about agglomeration, if you double the size of a city, the consensus would be that you'd increase economic activity by 2.5%, 2.6%. So if the north-south gap is 30%, then you've got to do a lot of doubling of city sizes to narrow that. So the gap is for a lot more than agglomeration. So the ability of transport can contribute to levelling up, but it's not the answer, if that makes sense. It's not the whole answer. So the department, I feel, if you're having strategic objectives, should be trying to quantify what it can actually achieve. In terms of the environmental balance and the economic balance, well, a key part of a dense city that is productive and is also a good place to live, which is also immensely important too, is active travel. The urban environment, the urban place is so important. So I don't see, a vision that is of growing the economy and a clean environment to be mutually exclusive. But, and if, for example, you feel that, an important part coming out of the vision is roads, but we've got to decarbonise the transport system, then maybe the government should be looking at massive investment in decarbonisation of the vehicle fleet, looking at it at a different angle, as opposed to trying to do it through infrastructure or restriction of people's movements.
Okay, thank you. Conscious of time, so I'll go back to Chair.
Thank you. Gavin, if we could turn to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think we touched on strategy, and I will cycle back to strategy, but could I start? And I'll start with Andrew. Does the government have a clear long-term plan for transport investment?
I think There are some known pipelines of things that are going on, and whether sort of finishing some of these really big schemes is long term, I don't know. I don't think that there is necessarily a cross Department for Transport plan of these are our long-term outcomes. This is how the transport network needs to develop in order to hit those long-term outcomes, as you might see in a utility company, for example. If they're a water company, then they are meant to have long-term plans, and they are there to build their network such that it meets those long-term objectives. So I don't see that in transport. There is a lot of master planning that goes on that says, what should the strategic road network look like in 2050? You'll have some scenarios, you have some different ways of developing it. But in terms of, do I see a cross Department for Transport plan? Not necessarily, no.
No, and come on to yourself, Stephen. Well, we will cycle back to strategy in my next question, but if you can answer the same question in terms of, is there a clear long-term plan for transport investment, is there any other steps the government could take to provide clarity on that, out with a strategy, which I'll come back to? Is there anything else at all?
Well, you've heard in previous evidence sessions about the benefits of the city region sustainable transport strategies in England, which have given the city region authorities some long-term funding certainty for capital investment in those cities. And I think there was a welcome for that from the Urban Transport Group and others. And we've seen the prospect of that being extended outside cities as part of the Network North strategy or set of projects to local transport settlements. I can't remember what they're called, which does give some long-term certainty, though, as the Urban Transport Group said, there isn't that same certainty on revenue funding. But it does mean that there is some certainty in those places for longer-term funding. There are all sorts of reasons, as Ben has alluded to, in relation to light rail, of why it's really difficult to translate that into a pipeline of light rail schemes. What we haven't seen is a pipeline of rail investment. There isn't a rail investment pipeline. It's been promised for some time, but it isn't there at the moment. In contrast to roads, where there is still a 5-year road investment strategy.
Well, you mentioned rail. Ian Docherty, who gave evidence to this committee, actually said that HS2 was as close to a coherent national plan as has been in place in decades, and obviously we know what's happened to HS2. So coming on to that national transport strategy, which Ian and many other witnesses have obviously said would be a good idea. You referenced yourself, I think, in your initial answer, or certainly one of your early answers. So I'll come back to you, Stephen, because you've already kind of given us a good hint as to what your answer might be. But Ben, if I can come to you, is a national transport strategy for England desirable? An overarching transport strategy?
Yes.
There are several transport strategies within the modes, but an overarching one.
Yes, I think an overarching transport strategy would be desirable. The issue is, I would say, if you're getting there, you run into barriers with our planning system, where you run into burdensome requirements that slow down projects and ratchet up uncertainty and costs. So if you're trying to cobble together a group of projects into a coherent pipeline, but you don't know exactly when projects are going to get planning approval, if they're facing judicial review, if they're facing extra consultation, extra barriers, it makes it very challenging to get a proper pipeline going. So we've looked at the Lower Thames Crossing, for example, and we found that their planning application has run up to 359,000 pages, and they've spent £297 million preparing to gain permission. This was designated a priority infrastructure project 13 years ago, and yet spades aren't in the ground yet. So if you're trying to get towards a pipeline of projects, you need to look at the planning barriers that exist that are holding back projects.
But a solution can be found for that. So a strategy is desirable, but there are those hurdles. Professor Laird, don't worry, I'm saving you up, so I will come to you with that question and a couple of others. Stephen?
Yes, in the State of the Nations work that we did for the Transport Planning Society, we said unambiguously that a national transport strategy for England would be desirable. And we did allude to, and you'll be familiar with this, the National Transport Strategy in Scotland, similar strategy in Wales, as setting out clear objectives. And they don't deal with all the problems, but it does give a sense of key priorities and where government is heading on this. I would say one comment about the Lower Thames crossing, actually. By the way, I'm not sure, I could only find 554 documents on the planning inspectorate, not 2,300 as you found, so I'm not quite sure where your numbers came from. But I think there's when we make a contrast with other countries, there's a lot of pre-planning goes in before schemes get into a programme, compared with what happens here, where lots of the planning happens afterwards. And you can go back to the Channel Tunnel, actually, where I remember the work that was done in University of Kent, where the French got all their work done on the rail link to the Channel Tunnel by talking to all the mayors in all the individual communities in advance, whereas the British had to go through all the hybrid bill procedure and so on. So there is the frameworks of transport planning and objectives used in other countries do reduce the kind of burden, whereas we tend to have negotiations that go back really to the old the way the railways were done through private bills.
Environmental targets have been somewhat newsworthy in Scotland over the last week or two, and you mentioned reduction in car usage target, which no doubt is a stretched target. It's a very difficult one, but I always make the argument it's a prism through which all our transport strategy and objectives is essentially planned and evaluated to some degree as well. So I don't know if that would perhaps be one of the benefits of it, but what else is missing from the current transport policy that a strategy would provide? You started to touch on there, but what are the other benefits of having an overarching strategy?
Well, I think it gives certainty, and also, back to a point I made earlier, it helps frame land use planning as well. And you see in Wales that they've got a strategy that links together transport and their climate change and their land use patterns, so that development is focused around the upgrades to railway stations that are part of the transport strategy. In Scotland you've got a focus on the urban networks and the development there. And you've seen, for example, on the Borders line, the Shorefare development, which was designed to put new development next to the railway. So I think it's about the framing of this. And in the Netherlands, for example, that's how planning is done. You have a transport strategy and a land use planning strategy that work together.
Again, I'm conscious of time, but Andrews, would you back a strategy? And if yes, is there anything else you can add in terms of the benefits that might bring? Before I bring in Professor Laird.
Yeah, I think it would be great. You would have to sit it in the context of what the government's trying to do in general. So if government's got 5 objectives, then you would say, well, how does transport contribute to those objectives? And then you can take decisions on that basis of what you want to invest in, how you want to invest in it. Of course, we're in a context where we don't have vast amounts of money to spend, so it would really help you to focus that spend in areas where it's going to have the most effect. I mean, what we tend to do at the moment is we tend to say we get a groundswell of support behind something, and then we keep reanalysing it during that planning cycle as we've described, rather than say how do each of these potential interventions contribute to that overall strategy and the objectives it's trying to hit.
And a quick yes no answer is, does Network North have any strategic properties whatsoever?
Well, look, it's a list of things that could be delivered or are being delivered as a consequence of money being freed up by HS2. Some of those will happen quickly. Some of those will have to go through the planning cycle that we've described. It could be seen to link to potential objectives, but it's not I think the point is it's not necessarily transparent what are the trade-offs that are being taken in order to deliver that set of interventions as a consequence of saying we now have more money as a result of HS2 going ahead partially.
I think a future in politics beckons with that answer to a yes no question, but well done. But Professor Laird, if I can come to you, you've previously done work for the Scottish Government with regard to appraisals, so I want to touch on that in a little second, but perhaps with your experience of that, could you perhaps tell us what you find the difference is to the approach with regard to transport strategy in Scotland with the DFT?
I work both in Scotland and England, so though a lot of my research and teaching is in England, but I do have that, can make that contrast. I think I would say that the Scottish Government were slow. I mean, they're not being as slow as the Department for Transport in developing a national transport strategy. They asked local authorities, city authorities to develop their own, transport strategies, but were kind of reluctant to do one themselves. But having done so, I think they're in a good position, because I think what a transport strategy does do, and the National Transport Strategy in Scotland does, is it gives a vision as to what they want the transport system to look like and be doing over the next 20 years. So, you asked, what is a long-term plan for transport investment? The transport, I think we would think 20 years is a long time. I think in England, the department, as far as I can see, plans on a 5-year horizon. So the Road Investment Strategy 3. Now, that might be long for a parliamentarian or in terms of the time of planning, but for an economist who studies these things, 5 years is not a long time. So I think the benefits that Scotland will hopefully get from having such a strategy is a direction of investment and travel. Now, the Scottish Government hasn't done a moratorium on road building as the Welsh Government has. It is committed to upgrading some of the remaining, the main cities to have dual carriageways between them all. But the National Transport Strategy in Scotland is supported by what was called a big piece of analytical work called the Strategic Transport Projects Review. Yep. And that looks to road investments over the next to 2042, or no, not road investments, transport investments to 2042. And what you find in there is that a lot of the projects that have coming out of that to fit under the National Transport Strategy there's no new road building projects coming forward other than the ones that are already on the programme to meet the overall aims.
And very quickly, James, because I'm conscious of time, you offered the appraisal guidance for the Scottish Government, or certainly helped author it. Can you tell us maybe if there's any main difference between the appraisals approach in Scotland versus the DFT?
I've co-authored parts of guidance. I would never written the whole manual, the pages and pages of the manual, but it contribute to different parts of it. Yeah. Ultimately, both sets of guidance sit under the Green Book. They form part of the HMT. The Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance (STAG) has a part 1 and a part 2. So the part 1 is what's called making the case. Now is quite closely aligned with what you might call the strategic dimension in England, but it's a lot beefier. I find and I see. So there's much more emphasis on that, what we call the part one, that strategic case. My observation than happens in England.
Okay, if I could move on, I'll start with you this time, James. How much control can the government, I'm talking about the UK government in this question, can the UK government exert over the transport system, and how much should it?
The UK government, I mean, transport is I mean, Stephen touched on this, local authorities are the best people to be talking about bus services, and transport is and quite rightly is a devolved matter, and it does need to be devolved. But one of the issues that we need is you have to have the coordination. And you need to get the investments delivered. So I think the consensus is, I mean what you find in like city plans is they are heavily dependent on what is they can control what's happening within their city, but they are also heavily dependent on what the UK government is doing, and it is in the main the holder of the main purse strings. So there is a responsibility, if only to set the budgets at the UK government, but that is very, very important in determining the direction of travel. But ideally, you want the delivery as close to the bottom as possible.
And lastly, Professor Laird, you spoke about coordination. How well coordinated do you think the approaches by different government departments are when it comes to areas of transport policy? Clearly we've seen lots of kind of levelling up projects that have been in the transport area of late. So how much coordination do you think there is between the government departments?
I don't think I can offer a view on that. I've not been close enough to those sorts of things. And
that's entirely fair. So thank you, Professor. I can come to Stephen maybe if you do you have an answer maybe for that last question?
Yes, I mentioned transport and land use planning, and I think that is one area where there really isn't enough coordination. And actually, there was a very useful paper produced a couple of days ago by the Department for Transport Science Advisory Committee looking at this, which was very clear about the consequences of not having that coordination. And I know there is a lot of work being done to try and join up the Department for Transports and the Department of Levelling Up Housing and Communities. But what we're seeing on the ground, I mean, as it happens, I mentioned we've been doing round tables on rural transport, and we had one last week on transport and development, and we had a paper from a group called Transport for New Homes, which has been looking at what's actually happening on the ground in England, and has found a lot of car-based development, with developments with limited or no public transport. And as the science advisory paper says, sometimes the public transport is provided, but much later on in the development, by which time everybody's driving. Because that's the entrenched pattern. And this isn't just a matter for those developments. What it does is add to congestion and therefore economic costs on the rest of the road network. So there is a case, and I mentioned the work that Create Streets have done in Chippenham recently, called Stepping Off the Road to Nowhere, which has looked at an alternative approach to this, where you take the 75 million that was promised from the Housing Infrastructure Fund by the Department of Levelling Up, or by Homes England, and which was for a big road, and if you spend that differently in Chippenham, you get the same level of housing, but much denser. It's gentle density in the Create Streets language, a revitalisation of Chippenham, much better public transport and less traffic rather than more. So, but those decisions are taken by different government departments with different funding streams.
And just to finish up, I'm very conscious of time, so can I ask, and I'll ask each of you in turn, can you give as quick an answer to this as you can. Does the DfT exercise too much or too little power in the current transport system? And also, if you can add, are transport powers or responsibilities exercised at the right level of government, which is obviously mentioned with regard to buses. I think we know the answer on buses, but in general terms. But Ben, if I can start with you, and again, if it's quickly as you can.
Yeah, of course. I think we need to devolve a lot of the powers and the funding abilities to where the main impacts of new transport investment will be felt. So if we're talking about a local tram, the powers of decision-making, funding and approvals should ideally be made at the local level. Birmingham East Side extension to the West Midlands Metro is a planned 1.05 mile extension to connect to the HS2 station. Design work began in November 2013 and a Transport and Works Act order application was submitted in October 2016. That included 5,718 pages. If laid end to end, that's longer than the metro extension itself. And it took 40 months for the Transport Secretary to give permission to Birmingham to build a mile extension on top of existing roads. I think these kind of case studies show that really we need to devolve a lot of the planning approval and the funding mechanisms to the local level where these local projects are being made. So
at the moment, a little too much power from a DfT point of view, because you would seek to devolve some of it?
Yes, I think that, yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Steve?
I think they exercise too much.
Can I just ask both colleagues and witnesses, we need to speed up a little, so
I'll keep this brief.
Questions and answers.
So, I think they exercise too much and too little power. So they exercise a lot of power, as Ben has said, over detail, and rather too little in the way of strategy and overall approaches to transport. So I would want more strategy and less detail from the department.
Thanks, Andrew.
I think I agree with Steve, and if you look at how rail services are delivered at the moment, if you want to make changes to rail services, then pretty much every point on the timetable is being determined rather centrally, whereas there are other areas of sort of perhaps larger policy involvement that the department could be taking, around connectivity, for example, making sure there's public transport available to people per se, which isn't happening at the moment and could definitely be happening much more from a central perspective.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Jack.
Thank you, Chair. We've talked a lot about public and government investment, but not so much about private investment. So maybe, Andrew, you could start and say what more could be done to encourage more private investment.
Yeah, it's a great question. We know that we are, as a country, capital constrained. We've got a fiscal rule that means that we are not really going to be spending much more on infrastructure than is in current plans, and sort of going beyond that, the public sector doesn't seem to have the capacity, or at least isn't choosing to spend that capacity in transport. And therefore, we need to deliver schemes, big or small, differently, and encourage private finance to come in. Of course, we've got a very high interest rate environment, which doesn't help. But one would imagine that if one were to establish a scheme effectively, and we're trying to do this in nuclear, for example, at the moment, then private finance could be encouraged in. But I think what you have to offer private finance is a degree of control and perhaps a lack of intervention, whether that's from sort of regulators or politically for quite a long period of time. So you have to really make sure that you're comfortable with that, or that if you do want to, say, have sort of 5-yearly periods where you go back and look at the investment and see how it's performing, then you do that in a clear way, with really clear rules of the game, so that investors have confidence in what they're investing in. And that's, of course, a quite different way of delivering schemes compared to the public sector, where you sort of undertake the scheme and then it's done and perhaps you move on to the next one, whereas the private sector will typically get their money back over a long period of time if it's a transport capital investment. And so I think you do have this important trade-off to bear in mind between the degree of intervention that you can have from politically or from a regulatory perspective, and under public investment versus private investment.
Do the current structures prohibit really that opportunity for private investment?
I don't think so. I think what you need to do is spend time creating the conditions for that private investment, whether it's a large scheme or a small scheme. Certainly there have been examples of schemes in recent years that have really struggled, that would be completely privately financed, but have then hit against the challenges of the planning system, for example. I think it's probably the case that investors will require that a lot of that planning that we've been talking about to be complete before they're willing to invest. They don't want to be taking planning risk and construction risk and operational risk. So I think you have to have horses for courses, and the public sector taking some of the burden and then allowing the private sector to come in.
And did you want to add on that? I saw you nodding. Is there any thoughts you have? Because obviously in some countries we know that private investment is much more common than we see necessarily in some of the infrastructure in this country.
Yeah. I think Andrew's completely right to highlight the effects on the planning system in dampening private investment into transport projects. It's, I think, currently too expensive for private companies to feasibly think about investing in building new transport directly. In France, there was a fully funded private motorway, the A65, that was built for just £10 million per lane mile. And you're never going to get those costs down in the UK unless we figure out how to fix the planning system. And if you take the risk and the uncertainty away from planning applications, I think you'd be much more likely to see private finance getting involved in the direct funding. And that's not to say that you can't have land value capture mechanisms to fund transport when you combine private developments and a new public transport, whether that's a tram regeneration of Salford Quays or investment into the Docklands that funded part of the Jubilee Line extension there. I think we need to expand that, but fully funded private infrastructure, I think, is a ways off unless we fix the planning challenges.
Would you agree with that, Stephen?
I would. I think long-term frameworks are needed. I'm not sure how far planning itself is such an obstacle, because we do have a good record here on particularly rail freight, where we have had strategic rail freight interchanges, though speaking as a resident of Hertfordshire, the one at Radlett has taken a very, very long time to get anywhere, and it's taken a long time because of significant interventions by central government, which were then found to be illegal and so on. So there's been a huge...
You think that lack of flexibility is a problem?
I think it is, but we have seen the growth in rail freight is an example of mostly private investment, but with a long-term framework of access charges and planning frameworks, including the National Networks National Policy Statement, which on rail freight is, has been helpful, I think. That has made a difference. But I think we need to find new and different ways of doing things with local finance, land value capture, which has, I think the committee's heard this already, on the Northumberland line, has helped finance stations there. So there are opportunities to do this, but again, a rather centralised system doesn't help for all the reasons that have been said. So we do need to see some devolution on this in ways that actually help local authorities do deals in this area.
James, finally, do you have any further thoughts on how we could encourage more private investment into infrastructure?
I mean, obviously, this has been around for many years. I think when we use private finance to help with the construction of projects, we have to look very carefully at the incentives. And we have to also be really mindful of the creation of monopolies and the ability to make change to the contracts. So transport infrastructure is really long lasting, and we have to, can we foresee everything going forward? And there are a couple of examples of private finance initiatives in the Highlands and Islands where the monopolies were incredibly obvious and have restricted the ability for the local regions to grow, and the Scottish government has had to buy these projects back at extortionate sums. I think the M6 toll is clearly not a monopoly. It's a bypass of another strategic road. So I think there are places where private finance can be used. I think where Stephen is pointing towards, I think where we are in my work is we're interested in how the beneficiary can pay, and that's in the land value uplift side of things. So the business rate supplement we see as a good way forward if usable.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'd like to turn now to the actual appraisal process. And James, if I could start with you. Just to give us, from your perspective, an understanding, is the appraisal process fit for purpose at the moment? Is it transparent? Are the right aspects scored properly? And if not, what changes would you make?
Thank you. Good question. Is the appraisal process fit for purpose? Well, I think we've already heard that there are 2 different appraisal systems, or 3 different appraisal systems that are in use within the UK. So we've got TAG, Transport Appraisal Guidance in England, we've got Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance in Scotland, and we've got the Welsh Government's Appraisal Guidance, which I'm not that familiar with, but it's very similar to STAG, I understand. So I think in the main, my view is often that it's the applications, not the framework, that's wrong. That's generally my take on it. And I've looked back over some of the Green Book revisions, and what they are identifying again in there is its application, not necessarily the framework that's incorrect. So a key part of the strengthening of the Green Book was in setting out what are the strategic dimension. So I think so. Even with a strengthened strategic dimension, so you have 5 cases: a strategic dimension, an economic dimension, financial, commercial, and management dimensions. Our impression is that what happens is that everything apart from the economic dimension is a hurdle to get through, and then the economic dimension is you maximise, if that makes sense, to compare between alternatives. I'm not sure that is fully what we want, but if the projects that come through are all part of an overarching portfolio that meet our strategic goals, then I think that situation works. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Andrew, give your thoughts on this, please.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with James in his sort of fundamental point that the frameworks perhaps are strong, but the application is less strong. I mean, I think personally I would look for quite a bit of reform of the way the appraisal system works. I think we have a situation where as James said, there's a lot of attention paid to the economic dimension, and it's really interesting that the so-called benefit-cost ratio, because it's a number, it's really salient. The amount of times I get called up by someone and says, "Oh, my BCR is looking a bit weak," or actually, how do we strengthen this? That's because everyone is really focusing on it. Whereas, of course, if it's a road to a housing development, then the BCR that's going to be reported on has very little to do with the benefit that Homes England might be getting from connecting that housing development to the strategic or major road network. So I think there's a lot of effort put into the economic dimension. The strategic dimension quite often ends up with a set of things that the guidance for the benefit-cost ratio isn't allowed to include. It's cast quite narrowly, and it's looking at time savings, it's looking at carbon costs, it's looking at accident reduction, and that all goes into your BCR. But then if a scheme is about something else entirely, whether it's that housing development, whether it's about resilience, then those effects end up in this strategic case. And certainly when Dame Bernadette from UK Department for Transport was here, she was talking about, we assess value for money looking at both economic and strategic dimension. I think my issue is that we have a highly comparable economic dimension. We can look across lots of different schemes in buses, in roads, in railways, and they are comparable by dint of the guidance, the way it's written and produced. The strategic dimension isn't comparable. It's not meant to be comparable. And going back to those strategic transport objectives, they're not. The strategic dimension isn't focused on a fixed set of transport objectives that may have been agreed at the start of a parliament between the department and the Treasury, for example. And so you have something that's quite narrow that everyone focuses on because it's a number. You have a strategic case that is less comparable, but we are then taking a value for money assessment looking at both of those things. So we either want something that's comparable because we've got a portfolio, we want to understand its value for money and it's affordable, or we want something that isn't comparable because we know that there are differences on a scheme-by-scheme basis and there's different things that we want to prioritise. So for me, I think we need, and maybe we'll come on to some solutions, but I think getting a better sense of how you fit together those economic and strategic dimensions such that we are quantifying what needs to, but we're also saying how we are contributing to those strategic transport objectives. I think that will be a much better and more holistic approach than something that's very narrow and comparable, but we're not using it from a comparable perspective, and then something that's incomparable but may be used on a comparative basis.
So in the current system of appraisal, if you had a scheme to build a road bypass or a new railway or whatever it is, which, yes, has measurable objectives on an economic sense, but will have consequential benefits, say reducing levels of traffic past a school or a densely populated area, which cleans the air, has benefits on fewer respiratory health conditions and the like. Are those properly appraised at the minute and that contributes to the overall decision?
Yeah, so taking a specific example of air quality, so that would be in the benefit cost ratio that a decision maker has in front of them. I think there are other impacts, so for example impacts on the freight network, so logistics, enabling freight from South Coast ports to the Midlands, for example. They haven't had as much attention as perhaps they should. Impacts on competition just wouldn't appear. Impacts on resilience, again, wouldn't appear in that benefit cost ratio. Now, that means that you end up talking about them in the strategic dimension, but they're missing from the benefit cost ratio, as potentially would quite significant costs in some cases. So, as I said, there are things that we care about that we don't quantify in the economic dimension, or at least sort of formally put into this BCR that a lot of people place their interest in. And then we talk about them in the strategic dimension, but there's a risk that kind of happens later in the process and ends up looking like a bit of a shop window for here's a set of things that we would like to have talked about in the economic dimension, but the guidance, largely because that guidance is looked at in planning cases by the planning inspectorate in legal cases, ends up being quite rigid, and we rather have to stick within that guidance and produce quite a narrow benefit cost ratio.
Ben, talk to you now.
Yeah, so I would say the current appraisal process is not entirely my area of expertise, but I would like to agree with what Andrew was saying and provide a nice example that helps to clarify it. So I think the benefits of time savings are clearly at the front of any proposal in a business case, but not the way that transport projects can unlock housing and agglomeration and changes in land use. So the East-West Rail is a great example of this. The benefit cost ratio of the first stage was 0.5 to 0.8, which demonstrates poor value for money. However, the strategic case for it was very strong because it's connecting, Oxford, Bletchley, Milton Keynes, and Cambridge, helping to develop a strong economic arc. So the phase one of the project got through based off the strength of its strategic case, but had the updates in 2020 not been made to the Green Book, it would have been chucked because of the poor benefit cost ratio. So I think it's very important, as Andrew was mentioning, to make sure that we aren't overly fixated on a single number that comes out of what we try and measure and compare between different projects, and focus on the strategic case that's made. And I think there's arguably a case to even strengthening the role of the strategic case even more in the appraisal process.
And Stephen, on the 2020 changes to the Green Book, what's your view on have they worked? Is it too early to say?
I think it's too early to say, because we've got a lot of heritage schemes in the pipeline that are still being worked through, like Low Thames Crossing and other things, for which this hasn't really been applied. But I think even within what is actually done on the ground, I think the whole point of appraisal is to help decision makers. This is about giving decision makers some real kind of sense of what is the impact of spending money on a particular scheme or set of schemes and projects. I'm not sure it really does that now. In evidence of this, I had a look at the mode shift revenue grant that is used to fund traffic to go from road to rail, and that used to be very based on time savings. In other words, the time savings to motorists for not having lorries in front of them. But even with the revisions in the wake of the Green Book and transport appraisal, it's still really weighted on that compared with everything else. So at the moment, a weighted average is a congestion, which is the time savings bit, is over half the benefits in pence per lorry mile. Greenhouse gases is 23 pence, and then there's a reduction of 32 pence to recognise the loss to the Treasury of revenue from lorry taxation. So you're seeing a bit of a bias there in favour of roads and road traffic, and the rest of the things, air quality is tiny, even though you could argue that taking lorries away from other roads ought to be more than 1.6 pence per lorry mile. So the other things that an average decision maker, a minister or councillor would care about isn't really being informed by these things. The other economic area that I think is missing still, or is downplayed, is widening labour markets. And we've seen that particularly in rural areas where the benefit of having better bus services, as Paul Howell said earlier, in terms of widening the access to jobs, is really important and isn't really rated. And in the work that a colleague of mine was involved in with Transport East, the subnational transport body for the East of England, on a call for evidence on rural transport, this came out really strongly as something that isn't really reflected in the in transport appraisal as it currently stands. And what that means, in fact, is we're not seeing the benefits of people who are now not travelling at all actually travelling from being able to access jobs or education opportunities and so on.
Thank you. Jack, you wanted a
Yes,
quick question?
thank you, Chair. And just talking a bit more about BCR assessments. The problem with a lot of BCR assessments is that they're looking at the sort of status now. They're using the data of what we've got now, which is not very good necessarily at predicting potential growth and potential economic uplift of an area. So where we've got in London, for example, a very developed transport system, we've got very good data that we can use to prove the benefits and prove our case. But where in other parts of the country where that's not the case, it's much more difficult. So what other approaches could we use? And I know in other countries, and we've seen in Japan, for example, they don't necessarily use that sort of assessment. They instead look more at the tax uplift, that the government will get in return as a result of the development that happens on the back of transport infrastructure. So what other alternatives could be used rather than doing a BCR assessment to better understand the growth potential from developing infrastructure? Maybe Stephen first.
I think you're right to point to the way other countries do this, and they still have some of these kinds of systems in some cases, but they tend to downplay them compared with everything else in relation to strategic case and so on. I think again there's a devolution point here that actually having centrally designed hoops for people to jump through doesn't really help justify transport investment. And a good case actually was the replacement of the Pacers in the north of England, which had a terrible BCR and which was resulted, I think Patrick McLaughlin had to do a ministerial direction to get that over the line. And that was partly because somewhere in there's a sense that there's some numbers that tell you that investing in the north of England's less valuable than investing in the south, which is, in the way you've implied, a bit of a kind of vicious circle. I think there's a devolution point in here somewhere to allow local authorities more freedom and local and devolved administrations and authorities more freedom in the way in which they do appraisal and they rate schemes, so as to give more weight to these things, and also in the way of giving more freedom to experiment with different kinds of revenue options, such as the Nottingham Workplace Parking Levy, or the workplace parking levy that has been applied in Nottingham so far, nowhere else, or the land value capture approach that's been used in Northumberland recently. So more of that kind of approach would, I think, be very helpful.
Are there any other witnesses that would like to come in? Maybe Ben, do you want to come in on that?
No, I think Stephen's done a good job of covering that.
Okay. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Just one last question from me before I turn to Fabian. Does the appraisal system look effectively at the cumulative effect of different appraisals of different transport projects? So, Ben, you referenced East-West Rail, which is obviously a rail project. But alongside it is the upgrade to the A421, 428 from Cambridge towards Milton, to Bedford and Milton Keynes. I'm not asking you to comment specifically on that, but if you have two projects like that which are in the same geographic location, do we appraise them as in the round, or is it just done on an individual basis? And if it's on an individual basis, what changes are needed to look at them more holistically? Andrew, if I could go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, we tend to appraise each individual intervention on an individual basis, so rather than looking at the cumulative effects of a set of schemes up to and including a bottleneck, we will look at the bottleneck, and then separately we'll look at those other schemes on the road or rail network leading up to it, and of course that does mean that we are missing potential future investments, but also it does mean that any individual scheme won't succeed or fail based on 3 other or 4 other schemes that may or may not get through the planning system at the same time. I think where we of course end up is that it may be that the benefit cost ratio would improve for all of them if you looked at all of them together. But I think realistically we are looking at things on a case by case basis. For in some cases good reasons, and in other cases we're very strictly looking at the project of interest.
Do the other witnesses share that?
Yes.
View?
Can I make a quick comment? Sometimes the best way of decongesting a road is to invest in the railways. We did a piece of work in my previous role as director of the Campaign for Better Transport. We did a piece of work which looked at where there was an opportunity to improve rail freight, and it was clear that on routes like the A34 to Southampton or the A14 to Felixstowe, actually some of the best returns would be achieved in terms of reducing congestion on the road network would be an investment in the railways. And I know that that's eventually led to a study being done jointly by Network Rail and National Highways on the A34, which is attempting to look at this. But at the time when the road investment strategies were being developed, it came up as something that was completely impossible to do. You couldn't even think about this. So I think there's an approach to corridor studies that's needed, and I think there's an approach to whole projects. And the worst case of this was St Pancras, where the northern ticket hall of the underground was appraised and rated separately from the Thameslink underground station, which was appraised separately from the rail link into St Pancras. Naturally they had very different BCRs and approaches. You have to think of these things in terms of whole projects.
Thank you. James, you wanted to come in briefly?
Yes, thank you. I think in answer to the question, does the appraisal system look at the cumulative effects? Well, in theory it should, and there is guidance in TAG to tell you to do that. In practice, no. You find that most applications that I've seen don't really look at it. So what should they be doing? Well, in my opinion, there should be an overarching appraisal of the programme, which allows you to see the strategy in place and how each part of the strategy is contributing. You also need to see how your example about 2 competing projects, how susceptible they are to the demands or the presence of these other ones. And this would be done through what we call the sensitivity test. And there should be many sensitivity tests that are undertaken to understand the uncertainty of what the other commentators have talked about is the benefit cost ratio. So we actually should be presenting a likelihood of achieving a value for money category, and we actually need to be giving likelihoods for each value for money category, such as we're unlikely to be low, we're very likely to be medium, we're unlikely to be very high, sort of thing. So you should actually be presenting a full range. And this has been a big push within the department over the last 5 years that I've been certainly working with them and delivering training courses for them. And I think it very much is work in progress. I mean, I've done ex post work as well. mainly overseas, where I'm drawing on, and really it's the presence or not of these other infrastructure projects that go ahead that have a strong influence on the demand, and then the value of the project and how useful it is at the end of the day.
Thank you. Fabian.
Thank you, Chair. Stephen, just following on from what you said earlier about the ticket hall, the Northern Ticket Hall at St Pancras, I seem to recall about 18 years ago that was assigned to be better value for money than line 1 of the tram system in Leeds. And thank you, Ben, for raising the point about Leeds, because I always bang on about this, but we still are the largest city in Europe without a rail-based public transport system, and it is affecting our economy considerably, and I'm sure James will know that as a visiting professor. My question relates to the transport appraisal process value, and I wanted to compare and value by different modes. I wondered whether, for example, how does the transport appraisal process compare road versus, say, active travel? I'm quite involved with active travel, because I don't see almost how you can do this. So every Monday morning I go along the Leeds-Bradford cycle highway from where I live in Pudsey to Leeds City Station, about 7 miles away, on my bicycle. But of course the segregated cycleway is used as a parking lot for vans that have to deliver off the dual carriageway. And of course that blocks the cycleway, so it makes it almost impossible sometimes to use. You have to get off your bike and go onto the pavement or whatever. And I wondered how we use the appraisal process to value the each different mode. I don't know who wants to start on this, Stephen, maybe.
There's a risk. This is the point, relates to the point I made earlier about the whole appraisal system is really supposed to help decision makers. And I'm not sure in city cases it now does really, because if you took it literally, those vans had much higher value than you and your bike.
Absolutely.
More the point about the vans is what one might call a sort of road management rather than appraisal issue. But I think the broader point is that, if you run bus priority or active travel through these schemes literally, they'll tell you that they're all terrible value for money because they hold up motorists who have a higher value for money than the people in the buses. So I think there's an issue, which is why I said that devolution matters, because it shouldn't really be for government to tell Leeds City Council or the West Yorkshire Combined Authority that these values, this is where the values sit. It should be, and in fact, in practice, with things like the City Region Sustainable Transport Strategies and similar schemes, all of this is set aside, and it's down to, the government doesn't require Leeds or West Yorkshire to fill in, to explain how this works in terms of time savings for motorists or any of that kind of thing. It's treated entirely at a strategic level, which is how it should be. But we're still, in the case of the tram in Leeds or elsewhere, we're still seeing centrally dictated norms and frameworks kind of getting in the way of some of these things happening. And some of this has changed recently, but I think we've got still some way to go.
And yet, if we compare, for example, travel times at times of high congestion, and this must be the same all over every city in the country, riding on a segregated cycleway is a lot faster.
It is.
So if it's about time, go use active travel if you're able to.
There's now lots of people using those where they've been provided. There's one other quick point I'd make on appraisal in general, which it tends to downplay journeys rather than commuting, and also the needs of different groups. And there's a large argument which we picked up in the State of the Nations about not valuing, say, carers, often women's journeys in terms of trip chaining, of joining up different journeys, of children and young people, the value of their travel and of them having more access to streets on the sort of Chris Boardman B network in Manchester, of making a network that you would let your 11-year-old travel independently on. All of that isn't in the appraisal system, and I think groups representing people with disabilities would argue that they're not represented effectively in the appraisal system. So there is an equalities issue around this, which I think is really important.
Definitely, and maybe another dimension would be that in cities like Leeds, it's often said that people who catch the buses are children, pensioners, or the disabled, whereas in London, everybody uses the bus. So how do we make Leeds more like London in terms of the use of public transport and therefore the segregation of bus lanes?
That's a much longer debate, but what it tends to happen, though, is past trends continuing. In other words, that the forecasting says, well, the buses in Leeds will always be used by children, pensioners, etc., as opposed to London, so that it will tend to frame appraisal or push people to frame appraisal of schemes in terms of what's happened in the past. And we see that in housing developments where people are saying, well, we're going to have lots of people walking and cycling in these new housing developments, and the transport, the TRICS database tells you, well, since nobody's done that, then we're going to assume that instead you've got to provide a big motorway interchange to cope with all the traffic. So that sense of getting away from past trends continuing predict and provide, as it's known, towards what transport practitioners are now calling vision and validate, in which you set out where you want to get to and then work out the strategies and policies and appraise accordingly, I think is a real issue here.
Do you think, perhaps I can look at Ben and Andy before coming to James, that travel time is often given the highest priority in appraisal methodology? Does it have unintended or unhelpful effects in doing so? Ben?
I think I might not be the best to comment on that.
Andy?
Yeah, I mean, you see across Europe that there's a lot of focus on travel time and a lot of schemes. We're comparing travel time savings to cost. And a lot of scheme appraisals, you get a benefit cost ratio. The benefits are time saving, the costs are how much it costs to put it in place, and it's very hard to see in that appraisal why you are doing the scheme in the first place. So if you've done an assessment and it started with, well, how do I get lots of people from Pudsey to Leeds in order to enable access to work, access to the delights of the city centre, you then start to say, well, we can have a cycle highway, we can have bus lanes, we can have potentially some rail or light rail options, and then you start to compare across those options, and in the end maybe you take a couple of options forward, whether the funding's central or local. But certainly how appraisal is set up at the moment is that you start with a big traffic model that's very detailed, is not very good at running the scenarios that James talked about, and we tend to end up with one number which has got assumptions about the value of travel time in 2080, but it's not telling you, that number's not telling you very much about why you're doing the scheme in the first place. So I think an appraisal setup that is more focused on the outcomes and objectives that we have, it's considering different options, different ways of achieving that objective, but then is well developed, the analysis is developed to tell you, is this a good way of achieving my objectives? Because at the moment it's a good way of telling you how many people save travel time. Now there's good economic reasons for doing that, but I don't think, as Stephen was saying, I don't think it helps decision makers, because I think decision makers will say, well, here's a benefit cost ratio, it's a number, that's important, I need to look at it, my brain is attracted to that number. Whereas in fact what decision makers may well then start to ask is, well, is this piece of paper in front of me, is this analysis in front of me, is it helping me understand whether I'm achieving my objectives? And also, because if you can run scenarios, you'll know this, what is the likelihood, and I think James hinted at this, what's the likelihood of me taking a decision that's going to look very bad in 5 years' time? What are the things that might stop this scheme from delivering the benefits that I'm expecting it to?
Can I now turn to you, James, and look at the transport appraisal system balancing the interests of different parts of the country? Obviously, Stephen has, and all of you have mentioned localisation of devolution. But how important is it, and how should we ensure that the transport appraisal system balances the interests of different parts of the country with the country's overall needs, if of course those two don't align? And does the current system strike the right balance between decision making taking place nationally, regionally, or locally? James.
Big question. I think with appraisal and valuation, which is I think which we're focusing on a lot here in this section, as opposed to the strategic dimension, what we are fundamentally interested in doing is valuing the impacts of the project. Now, if those impacts vary spatially, then we need to be applying different methods to, for that. So, I mean, the backtracking a little bit to the modal side of things is that possibly you might actually implement different sorts of projects in different modal projects. Different modes might have flavour in different parts of the country, so that could be a regional dimension. But you would expect, for example, an active travel project. The most of those benefits come from what we call journey quality and physical health benefits. So that's where, and these projects can generate very large benefit cost ratios, some of the largest I've seen. If we're looking at a sort of public transport project in Leeds, then we might be looking at overcrowding. Is overcrowding an issue? So these are quality type issues. So we actually would expect that in the first instance that you are including in the project, in the analysis, the values of what the project delivers and what those benefits are. And there is research on what values of CCTV is, crime prevention, all these sorts of things. And ideally those should be brought in. And some of those are in the guidance themselves. In terms of regional variations, well, a big regional variation is the agglomeration benefit. So whether we're affecting cities and how we're impacted on those cities too. So we would want to see that in there. We've got issues about income equality. We have issues about unemployment. So at the moment, those sides of things don't feature. Those don't feature in there's no guidance for that. I mean, I am working for the Department for Transport on developing guidance about valuing unemployment, primarily because it's something that we might see as being more relevant to the north of England and some of the lagging regions than being relevant to the south. So these things are there, but at the moment they would only really feature in the strategic dimension. There is economic theory about valuing these things, but how you can bring that into a sort of a standard guidance is another. I should explain it. I should also say that cost benefit analysis in itself, which is the economic dimension and the benefit cost ratio. I mean, the theory is very broad. It's universal. But what appears in guidance is a pragmatic set of rules that you can apply in most cases. Now, that does not restrict the stakeholders to staying within that framework. They can conduct research to take that forward. And certainly, I was involved in doing that for a project opening up a rail station in Wisbech. I think it's the largest town in England that doesn't have a train station. And, we were valuing reductions in unemployment. We were valuing higher sort of distribution of income equality and these sorts of things. So these things can be brought into the appraisal, but it does require extra effort and extra work.
Can I just, in concluding, Chair, ask one of you to answer this next question? Predictability. is that not one of the most important factors in appraisal? Is predictability of how long it will take to get from A to B. And that's obviously impossible on roads, especially during periods of congestion, but should be much more possible for buses, for trams, obviously for railways and for active travel. Because if you're going for a train from a station at a particular time, you need to know how long it's going to take you to get there by car, by rail, by bus or by active travel. Yeah. Anybody want to come back on that predictability?
I think it's fair to say that in an appraisal, time savings are focused on. Journey time reliability would form part of an adjusted benefit cost ratio, so not the primary benefit cost ratio that decision makers are presented with. Long delays aren't captured at all, except in some statistical maths around sort of time, the time savings. So if you're, as we know, passengers, drivers, they're really concerned about long delays because it stops them getting to do the thing that they're using transport for in the first place. And that's very much missing from appraisal. So, I think the answer to your question is yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Great.
Thanks, Chair. James, I'm glad you mentioned on International Labour Day the equalities issues, the issues beyond air transport and related policy objectives, tackling loneliness, the ability to access specialist hospitals, issues about children travelling, accessing employment and so on. It's interesting, the Coalfield Regeneration Trust published a report just a week ago on the state of the coalfields. Transport's a key issue in many of the former coal mining areas in South Wales and in the North East. It's a barrier to overcoming economic inequality. But because you've covered that, and I'm grateful that you did without my questioning, but there's a point I want to ask about the cost of delivering major transport schemes. And I think all of the panellists have mentioned it. You mentioned the comparison with road schemes in France, Spain, and Stephen mentioned some of the rail schemes. I was just reflecting on my time on the Hybrid Bill Committee. You mentioned HS1 and the Channel Tunnel. I personally have come to the conclusion, I'm serving on another hybrid bill actually, it's paralysis by analysis. It's a very long, drawn-out, protracted process, and no one's happy. There has to be some method of addressing concerns, mitigation, route variation. But personally, I'm not convinced that that is the ideal solution. Now, I just wonder, what can we learn from international comparisons? Maybe Japan with rail, maybe continental Europe with motorway networks. Stephen, would you start?
Yes.
Just before you answer, I'm conscious that I need to conclude this session in about 5 minutes' time, so if I could ask you to be very concise in your answers, please.
Yes, we do far too much paralysis by analysis, and I think there are better ways of doing decision-making through different frameworks of government and government support. The French have a whole framework of this, the Dutch too. So I think there's a lot we can learn from this, and I don't think the hybrid bill process really works for anybody really. I'm not sure the DCO process. As I've said, I think doing more early in the process actually shortens things.
And have you got any thoughts?
Yes, yeah. So we've done a big bit of cost comparison work. We've looked at over 300 projects, and the results for the UK aren't great. So building new tram lines in the UK is 2 times per mile more expensive than the global average. Underground lines, 2 times Italy, France, 3 times Germany, 6 times Spain. Cost of electrifying Britain's railways is 3 times higher than Germany, and we've got one of the lowest percentage of electrified rail in Western Europe, and HS2 is one of the most expensive train lines ever constructed. I mean, why this is the case? It starts, I think, with our planning system, adding lots of regulations, lots of requirements, increases uncertainty and burdens, makes it harder for us to build out a pipeline. So Germany electrifies 200 kilometres of rail every single year. We oscillate between electrifying effectively nothing and then trying to electrify loads, and realise we don't have the skills, the equipment, or the private investment available for that. And then we also have gold plating issues, trying to make things the best possible and letting the perfect be the enemy of the good.
Andrew, do you agree with that?
Couple of quick points. I mean, I think the hybrid bill does lend itself to lots of changes in a scheme design over time. I guess the DCO process, it does lock in a design at one point, albeit with lots of analysis and debate going on around that. I think the other thing that we're doing is we're assessing value for money repeatedly over time, say between an outline business case and a final business case. It's not clear to me why we're still doing that, other than to reserve the right to can something at that final stage. And it's not clear to me why we don't say this is in line with our objectives now. It seems to be value for money in a broad sense. Let's get on with it. Whereas we're still analysing stuff many years later.
An earlier session of the committee, we had the Permanent Secretary, Dame Bernadette Kelly, who was very robust in her defence of the economic versus the strategic case, the value for money, cost-benefit ratio and so on. Are we prepared to be controversial and say that the appraisal system and methodology is flawed? Do we think it needs reviewing?
Yeah, I think it needs reform. So I said already that I think the economic dimension is too narrowly cast. We have guidance that says do this but not that, whereas the strategic case then picks up that and quantifies it.
Yeah. Does everyone agree with that?
I think, very quickly, please.
I think reform is essential. Both in the type of appraisal done, but also in terms of how much it matters in the decision-making process. As I say, this appraisal is all about helping decision makers, and I'm not sure it does that at the moment.
Would you go so far to say the appraisal system is flawed as it's currently operating?
Yes, I think it is flawed.
Would you agree with that, Ben?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. One very last question, and seriously, a simple yes/no answer from each of you, please. Do policymakers focus too much on new infrastructure projects as opposed to other destinations for the investment, be it better maintenance, better timetabling, whatever it is? Yes or no?
The answer is yes.
It's very hard to make a value for money case for renewals and maintenance that's focused on new infrastructure, fundamentally, so yes.
I would say new infrastructure is still very important, so I would lean towards no, but we do also have to focus on maintenance.
Okay. And last word, James.
Well, I've seen changes between the different devolved administrations, so it's a yes in England and a no in Scotland.
Okay. Very well qualified. Can I thank you all four of you very much indeed. I'm sorry we have to conclude the discussion, but we're under a bit of time constraint here. So thank you again for your time. Order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.